Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. There are many public opinion polls in the run-up to the November 5 elections in the United States, but the only ones which really count will close that night, with the ballots counted and the winners in the presidential, congressional, and state races declared, hopefully, soon thereafter. Once the returning office holders are inaugurated next January, an anxious world will await new, or perhaps renewed, foreign, national, and international security policies from the White House, with or without Capitol Hill approval. What are these policies likely to be? To discuss these matters, all the way from the United States, we're joined by Professor Russell Berman, formerly served as a senior advisor at the State Department's Foreign Planning Staff, and currently the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Project at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's good to see you, Professor Berman.
Thanks for having me back, Jonathan.
It's always a pleasure having you. Also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Mr. Marshall Billingsley, who formerly served as Assistant Secretary General of NATO, as well as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury of the United States for countering terror financing. Currently, of course, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. A pleasure to see you, Marshall. Also with us here in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
So we will not be so foolhardy as to risk any guess on the results, either in the presidential race or on the other ones. But let me point out that some of the factors and vectors are very difficult to change from one administration to the other because of the other players, especially the global powers. They have their own interests, own policies. Also, the defense budget is set for the next year. The forces in being, those with whom you go to war are there. But obviously, a president can put his or her imprimatur on a change. And it will be very interesting, to say the least. Everybody here in the Middle East is quite concerned with what has happened over the last several years, especially over the last year. And we are all expecting to see what happens both during the transition between November the 5th and January 20th, and especially after the inauguration of the next president.
Well, whatever we may wish for, one thing is for sure, the 21st of January of 2025 is going to look very different than the one that was in 2021, with intensified friction in the Pacific, a war raging in Ukraine, and a war raging throughout the Middle East. Professor Berman, how do you go about a policy in such a reality?
Well, it's difficult to predict, except I would be relatively confident that should candidate Trump return to the White House, he would return to something like his policy from his administration. That is, going to the root cause of the tensions in the Middle East, that is Iran. Presumably that would mean enforcing the sanctions, which the Biden administration has let slide, in order to put pressure on Tehran to retreat from its malign activities across the region. Now, exactly how much pressure Iran can bring on Hezbollah? Hezbollah has been weakened. It's not defeated, but weakened, similar with Hamas, similar with the Houthis. Maybe one of the shameful side stories of the current conflict is the reluctance of the United States to maintain freedom of navigation in the region by hitting the Houthis even harder. What would a Harris administration do? I suspect it would be a continuation of the ambivalence of the Biden administration. On the one hand, asserting principles, asserting Israeli right to self-defense, but with considerable limitations. The same kind of ambivalence that we've seen with regard to Ukraine, supporting the notion of Ukraine winning, but refraining from providing sufficient supplies, sufficient military systems in order to enable Ukraine to win. So, on the one hand, with Harris, continuation, with Trump, return to what we've seen previously.
Mr. Billingsley?
I agree with what Russell just said. Look, we handed over a world largely at peace when we left office, when President Trump left office in 2021 in January. And the world is now completely on fire. The President Trump, should he win re-election, and I think he likely will, is going to have his hands full, not just with obviously the fighting raging across Europe and Ukraine, with Communist China's increasing aggression, not just with regard to Taiwan. There was a maritime incursion yesterday near one of the Taiwanese islands, but also the aggression they've exhibited towards the Philippines, Vietnam, and others in the Indo-Pacific region. But really, at the heart of much of the foreign policy focus in the early stages of the next Trump administration is going to be on the Middle East. I believe that President Trump will do several things, crucial things that should have been done by the Biden-Harris administration. First, as Russell mentioned, the full reimposition and enforcement of sanctions on Iran, choking off the oil exports, which have increased by nearly sixfold since Biden took office. Last year, Iran exported more than $50 billion worth of oil, mostly to China. In fact, the total windfall that the Ayatollah has had under Biden has been around $130 billion. And most of that money, that certainly is not going to help the Iranian people. It's not going into the Iranian economy. It's going into their weapons programs, their nuclear program, and it's going to the terrorist proxies. Secondly, I believe President Trump will take all of the restrictions off of U.S. Central Command when it comes to the Houthis. The damage that the Houthis are inflicting on the global economy through their repeated attacks on shipping in the Red Sea must come to an end. And I think a very forceful response to eliminate the Houthi leadership and their capacity to conduct these terror attacks is likely very much in the cards.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, let's focus for a moment on Kamala Harris's National Security Advisor, Phil Gordon, who is, according to various reports, her designated state Secretary of State in the future. Of course, speculative at best. Nevertheless, when we look at him, is he the continuation of a Antony Blinken potentially, or is that something that would also reflect then in U.S. foreign policy, as Professor Berman mentioned, the continuation from the Biden-Harris administration to a potentially, albeit too early to tell, Harris-Walz administration?
Well, that would seem too much of a jump in a pay grade for Gordon. He may end up as the National Security Advisor, but for Secretary of State, you either bring in someone with stature in the foreign policy establishment or outside it. Trump, of course, tried it with Rex Tillerson, then brought in Pompeo, who already had experience at CIA. We may see Bill Burns being shifted from CIA to state under Harris. He is the most experienced diplomat in the Democratic administration, but also a Senate ally could end up in this prestigious post. Too early to tell. We have to see the transition team at work. Apparently, the Harris transition team is a bit more advanced than the Trump one, but they can make up.
How so?
They have established their credentials with the General Services Administration. They are already down and running, while the Trump team does not. They still, of course, would have the 2.5 months. It's just a matter of factual reporting that the Harris transition team has been already at work. Of course, they have to vet. Trump would put a lot of emphasis on loyalty, not only on skill and experience. So let's not put the cart before the horses.
Indeed. Well, as the former head of the transition team in the previous cycle, Mr. Billingsley, I'd like to hear your take on that, since you oversaw the transition from the Obama administration into a Trump administration, and there were some deficiencies at the time. Did these impact the capacity to establish a rapid foreign policy that allowed the Trump administration to follow through on its aspirations, or were there challenges in that process?
Well, to be clear, I led the transition for the National Security Council part of the transition, but not the whole effort. It was very tumultuous in those early days in 2016, leading up to the inauguration, and any transition team is grappling with a wide range of issues, not just making sure that there's been a compilation of things that need to be accomplished in the first days of the administration, whether we're talking about executive orders to be issued, whether we're talking about executive orders to be repealed, or regulations to be struck. The personnel process, of course, is also critical. I would not dare to speak in any way for the transition team that is in place right now. But I believe that, in fact, the planning this time around and the work that has gone into preparation for those day one actions is very far advanced. I think, getting credentials established with the General Services Administration probably is not the right benchmark to use. The other thing I would just parenthetically add to build on the discussion of who might Kamala Harris turn to should she win re-election. Don't forget that the administration has a very accomplished diplomat in Beijing in the form of Nicholas Burns. I served with Nicholas at NATO. He was the U.S. ambassador to NATO when I was the Assistant Secretary General. While he and I disagree on a great number of things, I do hold him in the highest regard as a diplomat.
Indeed. Professor Berman, with such a transition occurring, how long would it take for an administration to exercise its foreign policy with the urgency naturally being quite significant, with so many wars raging and conflicts brewing around the world?
Some steps can be taken very quickly, executive orders. Some steps will require cooperation with the Congress, and a lot will depend, therefore, on the outcome of the House and Senate races. Some of it will depend on the effectiveness in implementing diplomacy around the world. Who is going to be speaking for the administration? Who is going to be speaking for the administration in various capitals? But it's not just a matter of what happens in Washington. As my colleague here at Hoover, H.R. McMaster, often says, the enemy gets a vote too. And a lot is going to depend on what I think above all Beijing does, but also, of course, Tehran and Moscow. As Marshall pointed out, China has become increasingly aggressive in the Western Pacific. And while, of course, you, Jonathan, there in Jerusalem are focused especially on the Middle East, it's only one of 3 active theaters right now. And I expect the Western Pacific to become ever more important. I am not an advocate of giving up on all other theaters in order to pivot to Asia. That is that's a miscalculation. Nonetheless, Western Pacific is bound to become ever more important. There's a timeline, maybe some people say 2027, by which Beijing wants to take Taiwan. It's going to take, it could take place no matter who wins the American election. That's a Beijing decision, not an American voter decision. And that's going to be very important for the United States. If Taiwan goes, so does the Western Pacific, so does Japan and Philippines, and the United States is effectively pushed back to, I'll say it, Pearl Harbor. That's not a strategic development that any administration, not even the Harris administration, could allow to take place.
Absolutely. Well, of course, H.R. McMaster is also the chair of the Japan section at the Hudson Institute, has also highlighted a number of times the necessity to maintain it on a global scale, since strategic power competition is global in essence. But with that being said, I do think there are more than those three theaters in play. Of course, the forgotten theater, Africa, is very much in play with the developments currently occurring on the Somali-Ethiopian front, with the Egyptians, of course, very frustrated with the Renaissance Dam already set to conclude its fifth filling, and seeing all of that brewing with Russia and China pushing for additional influence very close to, be it the maritime shipping lanes surrounding the Cape of Hope. Much of global shipping will be at stake in this context. But nonetheless, when we're talking right now, and we're talking, of course, from Jerusalem, focused on the Middle East, we do see, Mr. Oren, a reality in which the situation is becoming more and more complex. Irrespective of the tactical successes of Israel, a strategic success needs to come out of Washington. And if the foreign policy is not adjusted to contend with real challenges on the ground, it will also reflect not only to the Middle East, but around the world, with the Western Pacific, of course, being a prime place for, of course, devastating consequences for all Western civilization, the United States, and, of course, Israel as part of that group.
Well, surprisingly enough, the one issue the two candidates agree on, or have agreed on in various times, is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Now, of course, conditions matter, circumstances, context. In 2020, the same year, President Trump made Israel part of CENTCOM, and, of course, led the Abraham Accords.
Thank God for that. Can you imagine Israel being part of EUCOM at a time like the one we're facing right now?
Indeed. And he also published his vision for peace, which called for the establishment of a Palestinian state in 4 years. Had the Palestinians met the conditions, which is very doubtful, we would have been right now under President Trump's second term, during his second term, at the establishment of the Palestinian state. Of course, it never happened. And Kamala Harris, as does Joe Biden, they are also for a Palestinian state. This was before October 7th. This is before the Israeli war against Hamas, against Hezbollah, and all the rest, as well as Iran. So conditions on the ground have changed. But we have to see whether the basic policy ideas of the various candidates, the two candidates, have also changed with the times.
Indeed. Well, shifting sands have occurred in this region since January of 2021. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Billingsley, since on the one hand, you hear candidate Kamala Harris highlighting that, at least in her 60-minute interview with CNBC or CBS, that the main challenge and adversary of the United States is Iran. And even though I do appreciate that vision, since Iran is the greatest enemy of Israel, it is a fact that China is the number one backer of Iran. And when we're talking about superpowers, I'd like at least Israel's ally, the superpower, namely the United States, to put China in its place when we're talking about Iran rather than having it deal with the little things. What can you explain to us from a national security perspective on the complexity that the Iranians have managed to astutely couple themselves to, namely vis-a-vis China, Russia, North Korea, that has allowed for a certain counterbalance to that of the US-led Western civilization?
The Chinese are absolutely, I think, the principal adversary with which the United States should be concerned. But they do not, as a country today, pose the imminent threat to American life and limb that the mullahs in Tehran pose. Tehran, with actively funding, supporting, and directing terror attacks, including attacks against American soldiers in Iraq, the kidnapping of American citizens, dual citizens, Israeli Americans in Gaza, into Gaza. Iran is the current violent threat that the United States needs to address, needs to put down. When it comes to China, of course, there are a number of considerations. First is the secretive, massive nuclear expansion. China is in the process of building up its nuclear weapons arsenal to rival or perhaps even surpass the United States. China is engaged in a wide range of highly dangerous and destabilizing anti-satellite type activities. And of course, they have their territorial ambitions against Taiwan, as well as throughout the South China Sea. So the next administration will have to juggle a variety of actions simultaneously, bringing the hostilities in Ukraine to a ceasefire of some type, pushing the Chinese to understand that there will be dramatic consequences if they should attack Taiwan, continued decoupling of the United States economy from China so that we can employ the kinds of financial and economic measures that we have in the past used against adversarial regimes, talking about sanctions, for instance. But first and foremost, getting a handle on Iran's nuclear weapons breakout potential, and on the terror apparatus that the money has so freely flowed into for the past 4 years.
Professor Berman, to what degree will dealing with Iran, which is the easiest problem to deal with in comparison to the Russian and Chinese ones, bring about a certain reaction to the other theaters to the east and to the north, looking from it, of course, here from Jerusalem? Will this be a core focus of a Trump or potentially Harris administration?
I agree with Marshall that currently Iran is the most violent adversary, and a Trump administration will return to a hard Iran policy for sure. But there's a bigger picture, and that is this loose partnership, Iran, Russia, China. It's not a hard axis, but each of those players has its own set of interests, but they are cooperating with each other, and it would be the duty of an American foreign policy to try to break up that triangle by finding the right pressure points in order to play on the differences in interests. To the extent that there's a discussion between Jerusalem and Washington now as to where Israel is allowed to attack, I would hope that there's some discussion of the drone factories in Iran, which are feeding the Russians in Ukraine. That's an immediate and direct link between those two theaters. To the extent that winning in Ukraine is part of American foreign policy, and I believe even for the Biden administration that's true, cutting off that flow of Iranian drones would be a significant step.
We're drawing near to the end of this panel, and therefore I'd like each and every one of you to have a very short closing statement. Mr. Owen, we'll start with you.
foreign policy is not at the center of this race. Of course, the Gaza war is a problem for various constituencies in the Democratic Party, but the Trump pledge to refrain from forever war is apparently more attractive to the voters. So if there is a crisis, there will be no mandate for the next president to go in with troops. He or she will have to weigh the consequences and the political support.
Mr. Billingsley?
I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned in our discussion today, but it's the criticality of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. We all remember the video, the smug video of John Kerry, so self-satisfied, assuring everyone that peace agreements could never be negotiated in the Middle East. But of course, the Trump administration proved him quite wrong and negotiated the Abraham Accords with a number of countries, normalizing relations. I think one of the key focuses of the next Trump administration will be restoration of close ties with Saudi Arabia, and with encouragement as opposed to opposition, which the Biden administration has been waging, encouragement of normalization with Israel.
Professor Berman?
There are two aspects to a potential Trump foreign policy. One is the recognizing the urgency of a military buildup, a return almost to a Reaganite peace through strength. The other is opposition to endless wars. Opposition to endless wars is not pacifism. Opposition to endless wars is not appeasement. It is certainly a rejection of neoconservative adventurism, but it also means returning victory to the vocabulary of our allies. The notion that Israel might win or that Ukraine might win is something that the Biden administration has not been supportive of. And I believe that certainly in the Middle East, the Trump administration is going to be much more supportive of the notion of victory rather than endless war.
This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to immediately thank Professor Berman, Mr. Billingsley, Mr. Oren here in the studio with me, as well as all of you at home. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.